What happened to every country in Fallout? On October 23rd, 2077, the Great War began. It only lasted 2 hours, but the thermonuclear exchange wiped out most of humanity across the entire globe. Thanks to Vault-Tec and their various doomsday bunkers across the country, many Americans were able to survive the conflict. But what about the other nations across the world? What happened to them? We're going to be exploring the fate of every country in the world, and we're also going to be ranking them on their odds of survival, based on everything we know, with 0 stars being nobody survived at all, and 5 stars being about the same as the US wasteland, since that's really the best we can hope for in this world. Are there any better places to live than the wasteland in the US? Well, to find out, we have to go back to where this whole thing started. The Middle East. The Middle East is important in the Fallout universe to understand exactly how we got to where we are. Before the Great War wiped out most of the world with nuclear bombs in 2077, we had the Resource Wars. You see, in 2052, the world ran into an energy crisis, and we were running out of 2 things especially: uranium, needed to build nuclear weapons, and more importantly, oil, which is needed for literally everything else. There were devastating price hikes in oil, leading to a European invasion of the Middle East over its ever-decreasing oil reserves. You see, the US had done the same thing to Mexico 10 years earlier, when they themselves were facing a similar issue. So the Europeans thought, might as well get in on some of that action. They invaded because they needed oil, but shockingly, it turns out you also need oil to invade places, and a lot of it. Those tanks and planes aren't exactly being powered by the spirit of Christmas, you know? The oil was already scarce and rapidly depleting thanks to the war, and things spiraled fast. Whole economies fell apart, the United Nations was disbanded, and the world experienced the first nuclear exchange since World War II. The city of Tel Aviv was completely destroyed in a nuclear detonation. Then, there was retaliation, and some more retaliation, until eventually the entire Middle East was decimated. This gives the entire Middle East region the lowest survival score in this video, with 0 out of 5 stars. Now, Europe might have technically won the war, but as a result of this exchange, the oil supply dried up in the Middle East almost completely. This means that Europe couldn't get their hands on any of those precious resources they were fighting so hard over, and the European Commonwealth dissolved. And I don't mean dissolved in a nice, amicable way. I'm talking about complete collapse. Almost overnight, these countries that were once best friends only a few years ago were now locked in a gruesome war with each other over, you guessed it, their oil. This was referred to as the European Civil War, where every European country fought amongst one another, trying to get their hands on any remaining scraps of resources they could. The European Civil War started in 2060 and ended 17 years later, in 2077. Not because they all decided to put down their guns and stop fighting, but because the Great War broke out, aka the nuclear apocalypse. We might not know exactly how many nuclear weapons were used in the Great War across the globe, but considering that a confirmed 77 nuclear bombs hit Las Vegas alone, a city that's literally in the middle of the desert, we can safely assume that Europe as a whole received a fair few. But what happened to each of these individual countries? Well, let's start with Germany. After World War II, Germany leaned into their expertise in weapon manufacturing. They were home to the legendary German arms manufacturer, Heckler & Koch, known for designing and manufacturing cutting-edge weaponry years ahead of any other nation, even the US. They created several energy weapons before the Great War that are still used in the American wasteland today. But one particularly advanced weapon tells us a lot. The L-30 Gatling laser is referred to as quote-unquote prototype from the beginning of the war, but it runs on microfusion cells, technology that didn't exist until 2066. This means that Germany was still producing the world's most advanced weapons right up until the Great War. At first glance, it sounds like this would give them an advantage over their neighbors, but realistically, that could have been a double-edged sword. On one hand, this implies that there was a thriving weapons industry even as late as 2077, and that the Germans were some of the best in the game. But on the other hand, it would also make Germany a prime target for every other faction. I mean, it's not like they just let the Danish buy their own high-tech weapons from them, knowing that they were just gonna end up using it on themselves. The whole of Europe was at war, remember? That means there's only one way you're getting your hands on these: taking them by force. And to make matters worse, the fact that these weapons exist in the American wasteland applies that America and Germany still had an ongoing weapons trade relationship right up until the Great War, meaning not only were their fellow Europeans probably after them, but they also have a massive target on their back from America's enemies as well, like China. We don't know anything about Germany itself from after the Great War, which is actually somewhat rare for Fallout. Although details about other countries are always quite small and scarce, there's not a single post-war reference to Germany in any of the Fallout lore, and because of that, we can only assume it was completely obliterated into a lifeless wasteland. 0 stars. Norway. The only thing we know about Norway is that they still had some ability to navigate the seas going into 2077. We know this because in Fallout 4, the wreck of a Norwegian freighter named the FMS Northern Star can be found shipwrecked near what used to be Boston, along with its crew that the radiation had long since turned into ghouls. The sailors on board are referred to in-game as raiders, but they don't really behave like raiders. They only ever attack if it's defensive, and even as they attack, they yell things in Norwegian like, "Leave us alone." The fusion-powered cargo ship was clearly still making trips across the Atlantic in 2077, but it's unclear whether they departed from Norway before the bombs dropped or soon after. And both scenarios have serious implications. If they left before, the sailors would have set sail with hopes to return to their families, only for those hopes to vanish as bombs flew overhead mid-journey, leaving them as the last remnants of a nation turned to rubble. Bound by honor, they protected the ship, because it's the last thing that connects them to their homeland, even as their bodies fell apart and the radiation slowly stole their sanity, turning them into ghouls. But if they left after the bombs dropped, that means some semblance of civilization remained post-war, and at least a few people survived the initial bombs. It would be an irradiated civilization like everywhere else, but a civilization nonetheless. We'll give Norway a half star on the survival scale. Next up, Ireland. Irish immigrants shaped much of the culture of the East Coast of pre-war America. Companies like Irish Pride Industries and the popularity of Irish whiskey like Ishkabaha showcase this influence. Even the criminal underbelly of Boston was controlled by Irish gangster Eddie Winter. But as for the country of Ireland itself, outside of producing whiskey, we don't know much about what was happening inside its borders pre-war. But post-war, you can still find hints and clues from the nation all over the wasteland, including confirmation that the country still exists. A man by the name of Colin Moriarty runs a bar called Moriarty's Saloon in Megaton in 2277. But his accent tells you that he hasn't always been in America. He speaks with an Irish accent because he immigrated to Megaton from Ireland with his father. So this tells us that Ireland has in fact survived the Great War. Well, survived might be an overstatement. What we really know is that a couple people there didn't die. And Moriarty isn't the only person that tells us about the current state of Ireland. John L. Sullivan is a retired Irish-American boxer living in northern New California. While he isn't confirmed to be from Ireland, he does say something that takes on new meaning now that we know that Ireland is still around. He says Erin go brach, which is commonly translated to Ireland forever. A strange phrase to pass down for generations if they thought the country was wiped out. So you could assume that somehow the Sullivan family still has connections to Ireland, even in the 23rd century. Whether Ireland is thriving or not is unknown, but its capability for transatlantic travel says something. We'll put it at 1 star, because at least a couple people made it out, even if the rest of the country is a lifeless, mummified nuclear desert. Stepping next door to Ireland's closest neighbour, we have the United Kingdom. Even when the UK was falling apart with the rest of Europe, it still had some powerful and influential people. We can be pretty sure that the country likely still had a queen up until the Great War, because Mr. Handy, the widely available multi-purpose personal assistant robot, uses the line, "for queen and country." The UK even had intelligence agents, like Desmond Lockhart, one of the only known pre-war ghouls operating in the US during the Great War. But the real evidence of the UK's post-war survival lies with Alistair Tenpenny. He was born in 2197 in the UK and made his way to the capital wasteland to create a fortune. Now, this is huge for us, because this is our first 100% confirmed character who lived in another country post-war. The Irish characters were close, but it's not completely impossible that they didn't just pick up the accent from their parents or grandparents. But Alistair is a tried and tested, honest-to-God, tea-sipping British citizen. He's not the only probable British immigrant though. James, the father of the lone wanderer, has a distinct English accent. There's no confirmation of his origins, but he's the only one around with that accent, so he couldn't have picked it up from anyone else. Knowing that the UK survived, it's a safe bet to assume that James also made the voyage across the Atlantic. Now, I don't know if you know about this, but the UK has quite a large population, and the country's not super far away from the United States. So the fact that there's only 2 known people who have made the voyage across the Atlantic tells us that it's safe to say that very few UK citizens actually survived the bombs dropping. United Kingdom, you've earned yourself 2 stars. But what about Mexico, the enormous southern neighbor to the US? In 2042, Mexico City was hit with an earthquake, but Mr. Handy robots, you know, the assistance ones I mentioned earlier, put it back together brick by brick, so the city was now full of them. But you know what else Mexico was full of? Oil. And these days, that was hard to come by. That made Mexico one of the first targets of the resource wars in 2051. Initially, the US put pressure on Mexico about political instability and pollution problems, but that was just a disguise to justify military occupation and the strategic theft of their resources. The US took control of key regions from Veracruz to Puebla, and American companies like Poseidon Energy funneled money and oil up north to support the war under an affiliate company called PetroChico. But the people weren't fooled. But at this point, American soldiers were stationed everywhere across Mexico, especially outside refineries. And these soldiers were more than happy to convince you that they were there to help. But maybe being stripped of all its power and resources would mean that Mexico could have been spared from the bombs, right? Well, no. Unfortunately, Raul Tejada, a former legendary gunslinger turned ghoul mechanic who lived through the Great War, tells a different story. He grew up on Hidalgo Ranch outside of Mexico City. The crime rate in Mexico City was already high before the bombs dropped, but since then, he says it's become a radioactive ruin. He watched as Mexican civilization crumbled, and looters joined together to form the early raider tribes. Refugees across the country scavenged and searched for sanctuary. Many, including Raul, made their way north of the former US-Mexico border into the United States. Native Spanish speakers are all over the wasteland now, even as far north as Zion Canyon in Utah, though they aren't 100% confirmed to be from Mexico. As you can imagine, a nuclear apocalypse brings some pretty significant environmental changes with it. Radioactive waste drifted down the west coast and caused irreversible damage, especially to the DNA of wildlife. A New California Republic ranger named Hanlon claims that Baja California is now home to night stalkers, which are a cross between a rattlesnake and a coyote. Gross. Given that Mexico is a very similar, albeit slightly worse situation to the US wasteland, we're gonna give it 3 stars for survivability. In a post-war world, that's really one of the best scores you can hope for. But what about the US's northern neighbor, Canada? Welcome to the American territory formerly known as Canada, or, if you'd prefer, Little America. Before the Great War, it was genuinely not a bad place to live, all things considered, as long as you didn't sympathize with the Canadian resistance, that is, and avoided the Alaskan border. Oh, and ignored the constant protests and riots. It wasn't always like that. In 2059, an annexation began. The resource wars were already in full swing between Europe and the Middle East. So, naturally, the US began increasing its military presence in Alaska to protect its oil reserves and the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. But that pipeline doesn't just stay in Alaska. It runs through Canada, so the US stationed troops there as well. As you can imagine, Canadians weren't super psyched about this. Protests and riots broke out across the country, but there wasn't much they could do. Then, in 2066, China invaded Alaska, and the US military presence in Canada surged even further. Tensions kept rising until an attempted sabotage of the pipeline gave the US exactly what they needed: an excuse. On June 3rd, 2072, Canada was officially annexed and became a territory of the United States. By the 70s, Canadians were basically second-class American citizens. They were issued temporary IDs, showing that they were residents of the US, but, you know, not real Americans. There was always some politically motivated violence, of course, and protests were shut down with dramatically lethal force. Compared to the rest of the world, though, there was still a reasonable amount of resources left, and even new forms of entertainment. Comic series like Tales from the Front, cartoons like Armor Ace and Power Control. They were totally accurate, non-propagandized versions of exactly what happened in the war. The US military were the heroes fighting against the dangerous Canadian resistance, like the Yukon 5. If you were really lucky, as the Great War broke out, you might have even made it to one of the Vault-Tec vaults that were built after the annexation. And as you know, the vaults were all perfectly safe and nothing could possibly go wrong in them. So that's a nice thought. In this post-Great War world, many Canadians have survived, but the borders have fallen. a lot of Canadians migrate south in search of fortunes or to trade goods. Seeing as Canada is literally the same as the US, albeit with less bunkers and survivors, we're gonna give it 4 stars on the survival meter. Nice work, little America. But what about the real America? USA. Where could you find an America without all of that public political violence? Well, you could opt for the America with all the private political violence. Welcome to the richest country on the planet, the USA. Ironically, it was mostly isolated from the impacts of the resource wars, with the exception of Alaska. Home life was as comfortable as it could be, given the state that the world was in. Finally, somewhere safe. Well, not so fast. American society looked great from the outside, but it was a facade. The American dream was actually an American nightmare. Fear of communism, fear of economic collapse. It's this fear that made the country trade its freedom for the appearance of security. But was it really secure? Everyone was an outsider, and there were no alliances with any nation since the resource wars started. With the arrival of a virus called the New Plague in 2053, these words were never truer. People thought it was a man-made attack from a different country. Its symptoms, according to a disaster relief outpost terminal, were profuse sweating, unexplained swelling, massive external hemorrhaging, and worst of all, new ideas, such as socialism. America had to act, so facilities were immediately established by the defense contractor Westech to try and find a cure. And through lots of super ethical and very safe experimentation, they managed to create a new virus. Exactly what we wanted. It was called the Forced Evolutionary Virus, or FEV for short. It mutates the DNA of organic beings. It doesn't really sound like a cure when you think about it. It's more just another weapon to use against your enemies, but hey, we'll take it. In 2054, with the devastation of the Euro-Middle Eastern War ramping up, and the death count of the new plague skyrocketing, the US started the Project Safehouse initiative, and thus, Vault-Tec began construction of the vaults. So now, it was America against the world. Propaganda was everywhere. Uncle Sam was taking care of the Red Menace. Speaking out was bad for your country and fellow citizens. America good, outsiders evil. You'd think that people would recognize the obvious brainwashing, but eventually, no one questioned it. The news depicted the evils beyond the border, and even some evil leaking into the borders. The music on the radio, the TV shows, even the toys, all echoed the same ideas. Most never realized that all of it was intentional. The government initiative called Project Brainstorm, yes, that's the actual name, hyper-radicalized the citizens to make them more comfortable forfeiting their rights. And the thing is, it actually worked. The Vigilant Citizens Hotline was always available to report treasonous looking activity. People called 1-800-REPORT-RED on neighbors for having potlucks, just because they gave off a communist vibe. As the resource wars progressed, companies were effectively given free rein. Corporations like Vault-Tec, Grafton Steel, and Hornwright Industrial Mining Company privatized towns and turned forests into toxic valleys. But the biggest change came from automation. Watauga, known as the City of the Future, was the most extreme example, with practically every job being done by robots. But having a job wasn't much better. Mom and pop shops mostly disappeared. The mega corporations had practical monopolies in every industry. Vault-Tec, Robco, Poseidon Energy, General Atomics, Mass Fusion Chrysalis Motors, and Westech were amongst the biggest. No matter which you chose, you were guaranteed to feel like a cog in the machine, with all the same workers' benefits as an actual cog. Thanks to the Wartime Workers Act, working 12 hours a day, 6 days a week was the norm. Packed in with your co-workers like rats all day, breathing recycled air that smells distinctly like freedom. But the 11th and 12th hour were paid time and a half. What a deal. Workers were granted an occasional, strictly enforced 135-second bathroom break and 30-minute lunch. So much leisure time. Then, in 2066, the US revealed the microfusion core, which seemed like a positive step in the right direction. But that same year, China invaded Alaska, starting the Sino-American War, and a nationwide draft was kicked into high gear. The concisely named Patriotic Patriots of America True Patriotism Act allowed the government to draft citizens for practically any reason. You could be drafted to do anything, from fight in the front lines to helping conduct a door-to-door government census. And dodging the draft? Well, it would probably be the last thing you ever do. When the war picked up, the US started seeing some of its own citizens as threats. Executive Order 99066 was issued to put Chinese and Chinese American citizens in concentration camps without trial. By the time the bombs fell, the US was running dangerously low on resources, and the population was getting increasingly hungry. And now, in this post-Great War world, all that remains is the wasteland we know and love, irradiated from sea to shining sea, from the Commonwealth to New California. A true melting pot of raiders, looters, and vault dwellers. Despite the nation being obliterated by nuclear bombs, there are a truly impressive amount of survivors still wandering around the country, in no small part thanks to Vault-Tec and the other evil corporations that ran the place in the years leading up to the war. So, despite all of this destruction, the US earns itself 5 stars. Congrats, America. But how about those Russians that the Americans were so scared of? How did they go? Let's go to Russia, or at this time, the USSR. They were the first communist boogeyman, and one of the former world's biggest superpowers. The USSR was roped into the Sino-American War because American defense analytics considered it to be China's natural ally, since they're both communist. The US war worried about a joint nuclear threat, so it took them both on at once. Somehow though, the USSR still maintained diplomacy in the US, having consulates open with Soviet diplomats even up until 2077. Aside from that, we don't know a whole lot about them, but unfortunately, they did have one legacy left behind: human experimentation. Michael Masters, a pre-war electronic and biological engineer turned ghoul, says that he began breeding super warriors after being inspired by the work of the German, Russian, and Chinese doctors. It's always good to be an inspiration, I guess. Given that the US already saw them as a threat, you can be certain that the USSR was receiving the business end of a lot of American nukes during the Great War. The fact that we have zero other information on such a large country tells us that they were almost certainly completely wiped out during the war. So, on the survival scale, they're getting 0 stars. Sorry, Russia. Let's leave the Soviet Union behind and move over to Asia, starting with Taiwan. Taiwan was shrouded in mystery. In 2067, its government was destabilized as a result of something called the Pascal incident. Luckily, a new AI was developed in the US called Predictive Analytic Machine, or PAM. According to its logs, PAM was able to predict the best methods to destabilize the country, and surprisingly, they worked. Nothing was made public about the Pascal incident or the corrective measures that took place, so there's not much more to know about it. But for many years, it seemed like a Chinese invasion was always waiting around the corner, an invasion that never came. What probably did come instead is certainly worse. Now, we don't actually know what happened to Taiwan, so this is all speculation. But considering they were a close American ally within easy nuking distance of China, we can only assume that they were completely decimated when the war broke out. 0 stars for Taiwan. Japan. Japan was equally close to China, but they remained free from any resource war invasions. Even defiant, you might say. Right up until the Great War, Japan was still hosting American tourism. We know this because the Watoga High School PA system had pre-recorded announcements for their marching band raising money for a trip, with a fundraiser called the Bake-Off Take-Off exchange trip between the two countries. Whether this means the US and Japan were allies or not was irrelevant, because Japan couldn't have possibly escaped the destruction of 2077. Nothing is known about Japan's mainland post-war, but parts of the culture have survived the fallout. From Takahashi, the bug Japanese-speaking robot, to the Yakuza who operate in New Reno. Sorry Japan, but you're getting 0 stars. Let's move on to a much less US-friendly country. China. Welcome to China, the last global superpower outside of the US. When the resource wars started, China annexed most surrounding countries. After all, the People's Liberation Army was one of the greatest militaries the world had ever known. But with a huge population to support, the effects of having all those extra resources were cancelled out. The country no longer felt like a superpower. Driving was outlawed because all the oil was too valuable to waste. Even if you weren't directly fighting in the war, you were working in a factory to supply it. Food rationing started alongside the Sino-American War, but as the war progressed, shortages were so severe that a lottery system was implemented for basic resources. There were packed lines daily, where families either celebrated or broke down based on whether their number was called. Imagine having to win dinner in a lottery. But despite all this, there was still a strong sense of pride in the country. And honestly, it probably had something to do with the totally fair and not rigged at all lottery that seemed to favor only the most faithful citizens. Just one of the many creative ways Chairman Chang, leader of the country, inspired the people. Knowing the last real pockets of oil were in the hands of the USA, China's global nemesis, China took a diplomatic approach and offered the Americans a trade deal. Unfortunately, the negotiations got aggressive and fell apart in 2066. To add insult to injury, the US government followed that by announcing the first fusion power cell. There was a glimmer of hope in the ocean of despair, or rather, the Pacific Ocean, because China found and tapped a large deep-sea oil deposit in the Pacific. It seemed like the light at the end of the tunnel. With all that oil, things might have gotten better, but there was some unforeseen issues that made the oil dispute unusable. And by unforeseen issues, I mean American interference. Chairman Chang, with his back against the wall and no more options, decided on the risky plan of taking the resources by force. Chinese troops invaded Alaska. America may have had more resources, but China had raw manpower. And Chairman Chang was prepared to sacrifice every last man. What a selfless leader. Chinese technology was advanced enough to make many believe that Americans were primitive in comparison. Their Type 93 assault rifles were standard issue and significantly more powerful than the standard American weapons. And tanks were rolling out daily. But the real pride and joy of the People's Liberation Army was their stealth technology. Rumor is, no one's ever seen it. It's just that good. These rumors of invisible armies and even a ghost fleet of stealth submarines scared even the USA. How could a primitive country like America possibly compete? Well, the answer is power armor, a highly advanced exoskeleton that turned tanks into toys. The power armor was so good, in fact, that the Americans started to bring the fight to the Chinese borders. They were on the verge of invading, but then the invasion came to a standstill, mostly because the US was running out of resources themselves. Unfortunately for the Chinese, that didn't last long, because a new innovation hit the scene, the T-51B power armor. With that boost in strength, the US had what they needed to crush what was left of the People's Liberation Army. As resources ran out and food lotteries picked up, only the most faithful still remained alive, happy to give their lives to the People's Republic and Chairman Chang. But at some point, more lives wouldn't be enough. Resources were running too low to sustain the people for much longer. The US was bearing down to take everything, and China was a wounded dog, pushed back into a corner, shaking, desperate, and armed to the teeth with nukes. What's the worst that could possibly happen? Kaboom. Just like that, the world has returned to the Stone Ages, especially China, earning them a 0-star survival rating. But many individuals from China who are still stationed in the US managed to survive, still loyal and fighting in the wasteland to this day. So, if you were looking for an oasis outside of the USA, unfortunately that probably doesn't exist. The entire world was affected, and most countries were completely obliterated with nothing left over. So, count yourself lucky. The wasteland might be an irradiated hellhole full of people and creatures that are trying to kill you, but it may literally be the best place this world has to offer.